Hello, everyone. About 40 years ago, I met James Penton. At the time, we were both Jehovah's Witnesses. He was a well-known elder, at the time living in Lethbridge, Alberta, had just written a book defending Jehovah's Witnesses in Canada, which met with widespread acclaim, especially among the intellectual community, university professors and the like. He is a historian and was a professor at the university teaching history for quite some time. Anyway, he was disfellowshipped shortly thereafter for apostasy, and at the time I thought that, like everyone else, because we were conditioned to think that way, that he had just become very proud and wanted to start his own religion. Of course, now I know differently. I know that pride has nothing to do with it, quite the opposite, because a proud person craves the status that you get by being a well-respected elder in the community of Jehovah's Witnesses. Getting shunned by everybody is hardly what a proud person seeks. Nevertheless, that is the fantasy that the organization promotes, so that they can hide the real truth. And of course, the real truth in his case was he had problems with 1975 and the fact that the organization tried to heap all of that onto the brothers and deny any real responsibility and refuse to apologize. And of course, there was also the question of the door-to-door witnessing, which at the time was disputed in the governing body. We only found out about that a long time afterwards, and which has no scriptural basis. All that aside, he was disfellowshipped and I basically forgot about him. Then, of course, I woke up, realized the truth, and began to study the Bible for itself instead of through the publications. And as a result, also got disfellowshipped, appealed it, got disfellowshipped anyways, appealed it to the governing body, which you can do, by the way, and have not heard back from them. So officially, I'm still under review in the appeal process, although I'm sure to their minds I'm disfellowshipped. It doesn't really matter to me, of course, because I look at it the same way the apostles did when the highest court of the land threw them out, and they went rejoicing because they had been considered worthy of being dishonored as their master Jesus had been dishonored. So it is really a badge of honor to be disfellowshipped for standing up to what is right and true. So it does serve us to look into the history of Jehovah's Witnesses, and recently James found me through the videos, contacted me. He only lives about an hour's drive away. He's 87 now, but his mind is as sharp as ever, and he wanted to help out with the work we're doing. Of course, his wealth of information from a historical perspective is something we want to take advantage of. And so this will be the first of a series of videos in which James will expound on the history leading up to the creation of the witness movement. And it's really fascinating to go see how far back in history it goes and to find out the real truth, not the one that is fabricated through the publications, but the real truth of all of those who went to contributing to the doctrinal and organizational framework that witnesses hold to today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce James Penton, who will begin by talking about the pre-Russell and Russell era.
Good morning. I'm Jim Penton, and I'm speaking here on behalf of Berean Pickets. I want to talk a little bit today about the origins of the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Bible student movement that preceded them. Now, I'm a historian, a professional historian. I have a Doctor of Philosophy degree from the University of Iowa, and this is why the historical approach is so important to me. And I've written a number of books on Jehovah's Witnesses and their predecessors. And I want to talk about where some of the ideas that they have come from. Now, in the first place, it's often been said by people who are critical of Jehovah's Witnesses that all of the ideas that are worthwhile keeping from Jehovah's Witnesses, if you happen to be someone who has left that movement, as I have, all of the ideas that they have that are useful and biblical are based on ideas that they got from somewhere else, although they got a lot of ideas from other sources which were perhaps not that good either. But it's often said, all right, they have some ideas which are good ideas, but they also have some very bad ideas, and most of the bad ideas have been created by themselves. And I think that that's a real good starting point to use in talking about the ideology and the conceptions of Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, first of all, everyone will recognize that they are millenarians. The idea that they're millenarians is the idea that they place a great deal of their thought and their ideology and their preaching on the millennium, which they believe is soon to occur right here on the earth. But besides that, they are also dispensationalists. And that means that they break down the history of mankind as they see it into various periods. And those periods, such as the period from Adam to after the flood, and right on down to Moses and the creation of the Mosaic law. That was one period. Then there's a period from that time to Christ, and then there is a new period or a third period. And where do they get these ideas from? Where do they get the ideas about the near approach of the millennium? Well, the answer is that they got it from a lot of sources, and it's generally supposed that most of those sources are with the various Adventist groups in the United States, and Jehovah's Witnesses and their predecessors, the Bible students, are often referred to as an Adventist sect. However, that's not quite right. It is true that they took some of their ideology and their theology from the Adventists, but the majority of their ideas came from a much earlier source, the source of Great Britain. Now, if you go back into history, there were movements in the early church that emphasized the soon coming of Jesus Christ, or the second coming of Jesus Christ. That continued for some time, and some of the ideas of those persons in the early church have been taken over by Jehovah's Witnesses and their Bible student predecessors, such as the idea of a 6,000 year period from the creation of the earth down to the end of the sixth day, and they think of each day as being 1,000 years. That's an old idea that goes back several thousand years now. But, and then, of course, the seventh day is seen as the millennial day. But besides that, there are many ideas that they have taken that come right out of the Middle Ages. And from the High Middle Ages right down to the present time, there have been movements, many movements, that have marked a period which was to bring in the millennium, the second coming of Christ and the millennium. And we see this in the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages. We see this in the Protestant movements in the 16th century. And we see it in the 17th century. And outstanding persons, many outstanding persons, believed these ideas. And one of these was the great English physicist, Isaac Newton. And then there were many, many others. And over time, there were many prophecies considering when the end would come. And in every case, they failed. These dates failed. Such as William Miller, the founder of the Adventist movements in the United States. He prophesied 1843 and then was encouraged to prophesy 1844. Both dates failed. And then, of course, we come to Nelson Barber, who thought that the end was going to come in 1873, and when it didn't come in 1873, he said, well, it'll come in 1874, and of course it didn't come in 1874. So we get this pattern of choosing dates, and this is one of the aspects of the Bible student movement and of Jehovah's Witnesses that has been a constant. And many, many dates have been set: 1874, 1878, 1914, 1917, 1919, 1925, and most recently, of course, 1975. Well, these millenarian ideas have come about in a curious way. Now, in general, what has happened is that the prophetic books in the Bible, such as Daniel and Revelation, are generally used as the basis for this millenarianism and the selecting of dates. And yet, there's much more to the Bible student movements than the selecting of dates. What are some of these things? Well, one of the key events in modern history, which is recognized by almost everybody, and certainly by historians, is the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was seen as marking a redevelopment of millenarian ideas. And the founder of the Bible student movement, Charles Taze Russell, started his period of the end times in 1798, an idea which was very common among millenarians, particularly in Great Britain and in England. And we see that the French Revolution and the seizure of Rome by French armies and the removal of the Pope for a time was seen as a mark of the end times. And this caused all sorts of speculation in England. Now, curiously, this ended up in a very important movement, which was to spawn two new religions in Great Britain and abroad. What were these two new religions? Well, one was the Catholic Apostolic movement. The other one was the Plymouth Brethren, and I'll talk about them in the next few moments, but I want to move back to what was known as a series of meetings and discussions at Albury Park, just outside of London. This was under the auspices of a man by the name of Henry Drummond, but there were many others there who were very influential, such as Edward Irving. Now, the Albury Park conferences were very important, and their ideas spread. What were some of the ideas that they had? Well, some of them had come to believing in a two-stage coming of Jesus Christ, coming with his angels and his saints, and meeting the resurrected Christians who would join him in the air. And of course, those Christians who were still alive would also be taken up in the air in what is commonly called the rapture by fundamentalist Christians to our own day. This was a very important thing, but it was buttressed by someone else. And this is a curious thing, very curious thing. In 1767, the Spanish king ordered that all of the members of the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church should be removed from all of his dominions. And the result was that all Jesuits in Latin America and in Spain itself were taken out of the Spanish Empire and had to go into exile. One of those Jesuits was a Chilean, Manuel Lacunza y Diaz. And Lacunza y Diaz settled in a small community in Italy, Imola, and he became very bitter over what had happened, and he began to study a great many things in the past, and he came to disagree with the famous Catholic saint Augustine of Hippo. And he became a millenarian himself. He also took a position which was very Protestant, and that was that the Bible should be interpreted literally unless it was very clear that it was symbolic. He masqueraded himself as a Jewish convert to Christianity, and he condemned the Catholic priesthood, even though he had been a priest himself. Now, his works were never printed in his lifetime, but after he died, he accidentally died about 1801. He was drowned in Italy, but he left a manuscript of his ideas. And when Napoleon invaded Spain, some Spaniards got a hold of his manuscript and had it printed. And the leading revolutionary in what is today Argentina produced a work in Spanish of his very, very fulsome ideas. Now, it wasn't very long before those ideas began to be translated in other countries, in France, and eventually in England. And the man who translated Lacunza, as we should know him, was Edward Irving. He took off a whole summer to learn Spanish and translate the book. And it's a huge, huge volume. Now, he presented this to the to his fellows in the conferences that were being held from 1925 to 1825, pardon me, 1825 to 1830. And some of his ideas were to be carried on beyond that to another series of meetings in Powerscourt, Ireland. And one of the men who was present at these meetings was a former Anglican by the name of John Nelson Darby. And Darby was perhaps the most important spokesman for the ideas that came out of the Powerscourt conferences, which were influenced by what had happened in England. And Darby was to become a real evangelist for many of these ideas, including the ideas of Lacunza. And Darby came to the United States, where his ideas were picked up by a great many clergy and were common in the United States by the latter part of the 19th century. And many of those ideas were to be picked up by the founder of the Watchtower Society, Charles Taze Russell. And so the Bible students and the Jehovah's Witnesses owe a great deal to Darby and to the Plymouth Brethren and to the Allport conferences and to those that were in attendance on them. Now, these religious movements that were founded by them, by these conferences, still exist. The Apostolic Catholic Church died out in England, but it became the new Apostolic Church in Germany. And during the Nazi period, as one British historian has said, they became more Nazi than the Nazis. So the fallout from these conferences has been absolutely massive, and most people don't know about that. It's also true that the idea that Russell picked up about Christ's second coming came from Great Britain. The idea was, of course, that Christ would come invisibly. And that idea was kicked around by a great many people, largely evangelicals, many of them Anglicans, in Great Britain in the 19th century. And there was a journal in England called the Rainbow, and practically all of Russell's associates knew a good deal of what was in the Rainbow, and the whole question of the invisible presence, the nature of the second coming, all of these things were discussed right there, and Russell certainly parroted many of the ideas that were in the Rainbow. The person who was the overseer of this, the editor of this journal, for the last 2 years of its existence, was the famous Bible translator Rotherham, who produced the Emphasized Bible. And he was very warm to Russell because of Russell's picking up some of the ideas that he had. And so we see instance after instance of where the ideology for the Bible student movement and the Jehovah's Witnesses came primarily from Great Britain and not from the North American Adventist movement, although certainly it has to be said that Charles Russell had real respect for William Miller, even though he differed from Miller on many things. Miller was a staunch Trinitarian. Russell became an Arian, but many of the later Millerites became anti-Trinitarians. And even the Seventh-day Adventist movement, when it was early developed, was largely Arian rather than Trinitarian. And it was Mrs. White, Ellen White, who brought about the change in the Adventist movement, the Seventh-day Adventist movement, from Arian to Trinitarian. Russell, however, did a distinct change in that he kept the older idea of many of the post-1844 Adventists who had actually remained non-Trinitarians for a long time. And there are people within the Seventh-day Adventist movement who are now investigating the whole question of whether they should be Trinitarians or Arians or non-Trinitarians in some other form. Now, you can see from all of this that Russell really borrowed heavily from Great Britain, and his mentor in the first instance, who was responsible for his dive into considering that you could figure out when the end would come, that was Nelson Barber. Nelson Barber had been associated with the Adventist movements, and then after the failure of the Adventists to see Jesus return, he went off to the goldfields of Australia, and he came back and passed through England on his way back to the United States from Australia. And he got into the British Library, found some ideas there, and he particularly found the idea that Nebuchadnezzar pictured the church or God's organization in ancient times. And then when he went mad, he pictured the Gentile nations ruling over the world. And then when he came back to his sanity, he was to picture the restored Christian church and the coming of Christ. So you get all of this from Barber, who once again, like so many others in America, got his primary ideas from Great Britain. This was the source of these ideas. And some of them were good and some of them were bad, but they were all pretty well English rather than American. And they were brought to America where they bore much fruit. And it was, of course, Barber who gave the whole schemata, which was basis to the Bible students' thinking, to Russell's thinking, and after a good deal of mutation, it's basic to what the Jehovah's Witnesses teach today. However, some people call these ideas Russellite, after Charles Taze Russell. Really, they should call it Barbarite. Some might say even barbarian, because practically all of the schemata for seeing the year 1914 as the second coming of Christ, all of the basic ideas came from Barber, not from Russell. So this gives you an idea then of some of the things that were taught in Great Britain and brought to America and ultimately developed in the writings of Charles Taze Russell. One might say from all this that Russell had very few of his own ideas. He borrowed them from all sorts of people. And he also borrowed some from an American theologian by the name of Syce. Now, Syce was raised in the in one of the smaller churches of America and of Europe, and then he became a Lutheran pastor, and he became perhaps the foremost American theologian who was also a millenarian. And many of the ideas that Russell also had came from Syce. So, and Syce was a contemporary of Russell, and the relationship between Russell and Syce is very interesting, and it's something that needs to be studied in depth. So all of these things show that Russell had very few ideas of his own, but curiously, it was his wife who gave him a particular idea that has stuck with his followers from that day to this, and that was the idea that he was the faithful and wise servant, or as Jehovah's Witnesses use the term now, I'm going to say the faithful and discreet slave. They've changed it a little bit to reflect what is written in their own biblical translation, the New World Edition. Now, Russell didn't develop the concept himself. It was his wife, who was a very, very intelligent woman. And she claimed, which he denied, but she was probably telling the truth, that the first 4 volumes of his studies in the scriptures were as much her writing as they were his. What caused the breakup of the Russells, even after she had in effect labeled him the faithful and wise servant, was that they entered into a curious relationship. And that was the idea that they should be married but should never consummate their marriage sexually. And apparently Russell claimed that that didn't bother him too much. And there are all sorts of ideas on why he didn't concern himself with this. Now, she apparently was a very frustrated woman. And she had good reason to be frustrated. At their ultimate trial for divorce from bed and board, which really meant separation, she brought up something that was very shocking about Russell, and was bandied about in the press, and that was that he had made a pass at a young woman who had stayed in their home for some time, and he said his answer to this was this young woman was only a girl, a very young girl who wore skirts like a young girl, and he had dandled her on his knee. Well, the fact of the matter is that she wasn't a young girl. We know when she was born. She was born in 1870, and what occurred was in the 1890s. We also know that she was a director of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. Rose Ball was her name. And she ultimately ended up with her husband, who had been a secretary, treasurer of the Watchtower Society, and she had later married him. But she apparently went to Mrs. Russell and told Mrs. Russell that Russell himself had had her on his knee, and he had been touchy-feely. Now, there is no evidence that he ever committed adultery, but this showed that he did have some sex drive anyway, which he channeled towards Rose Ball rather than towards Mrs. Russell. And Mrs. Russell never said anything about this until the trial in 1906, and yet she had been told this many years before by Rose, who had had a bad conscience about the whole thing, and said she didn't want this to continue, and she ultimately married a man by the name of Henninges. And they were sent to various places, first to Germany, then to England, and just before the trial for bed and board, he sent them off, the couples, Henninges and Rose, to Australia. And so Russell himself lied about this matter. And this went into a little booklet by Judge Rutherford, his successor. And this little booklet attempted to defend Russell by saying that, oh, she had only been a little girl. And we see here where Russell was really not the man that many Bible students and Jehovah's Witnesses believed that he was. I think that he was shell-shocked by the divorce. Divorce from bed and board. I'll get it right yet here. And on January the 1st, 1970, he published an article in the Watchtower magazine in which he reverted to some earlier ideas that he had had when he was first in association with Barber and immediately later thereafter. One of these was a very curious idea. He said in this new Watchtower magazine that Christians were not under the new covenant, which Christ had initiated at the Last Supper. But really, the new covenant would only apply to the Jews during the millennium. Now, Russell had taken the idea that the Jews were still God's chosen people, that they would be restored to Palestine, that they would rule mankind during the millennium on earth. And he even held a meeting with a number of Jewish leaders in New York, where he praised them and indicated that he didn't believe Bible students should preach to the Jews and attempt to convert them. And he ended this with the singing of the Zionist national anthem, Hatikvah. And he has been glorified by certain Jewish communities ever since that day. The Jews thought he was a great man. And although he didn't attempt to convert Jews, many Jews became early Bible students. So he had taught all of this, and then he came up with this idea in 1907 that it would that the new covenant would apply to the Jews during the millennium. Now this created a tremendous brouhaha in the Bible student community. His two nieces and his nephews-in-law, who had been high up in the Watchtower Society, broke completely with him and left. And so did Henninges and Rose Ball Henninges in Australia. And they took a very strong stand against what he was teaching, and he became furious and said some very hard things about them, and blamed Rose for some of this because he evidently felt terribly offended that she had gone to Maria Russell's wife, and told her about his being touchy-feely with her. And so there was a complete break. And this occurred in Australia, where the Watchtower Society branch was taken over by Henninges, and they called themselves the New Covenanters. Now, I have a lot of respect for the New Covenanters. Much of what went into Watchtower thinking and Russell's thinking was the idea that the Bible was full of types, and they could be applied as antitypes. And that has been an aspect of the Bible student movement and Jehovah's Witnesses right up to the last few years, where they've abandoned the idea, outwardly at least, although they're still keeping some of the old types that have nothing to do with what the Bible says about types. There are a few cases of types in the Bible, and the idea of types and antitypes comes from that. But if you look at the large number of types and antitypes which Bible students and Jehovah's Witnesses have come up with, some of them are absolutely crazy. And I don't apologize for saying this in those words. Now, the New Covenanters in Australia very shortly said, no, unless a type is clearly present in the Bible itself, we can't use it. We can't go around inventing types and saying, well, this is a type in the Bible and it applies to us today. And interestingly, the New Covenanters still are in existence in Australia. It's a small movement there. But I helped them recover some of their journals that had been lost, and they had been reproduced by a brother in California. And although he had died at the time, I was able to reach his son and his widow, and the New Covenanters now have all their old literature. And out of their appreciation for that, they regularly send me their little journal. It's very small, and I read it and I enjoy it, because here are some brothers who are seemingly more Bible-oriented than the Jehovah's Witnesses or the old Bible students were. Russell got into a great deal of trouble over this, and in his anger at the New Covenanters, he claimed to be the faithful and wise servant. And one can look this up in the old Watchtower reprints. Now, the Watchtower Society has long said that he never claimed to be the faithful and wise servant. But the fact of the matter is, he clearly outlined it. He said, some of the New Covenanters were saying, well, he's certainly not the wise, faithful and wise servant. So what Russell said was, well, some of my enemies say I'm not, and but my friends say I am, and my friends are right. I'm paraphrasing here, but I could find the actual quote of that. So Russell was a curious person who bought into a lot of ideas which were just nonsensical, such as the argument that the Great Pyramid represented the stone, the Bible in stone, and this sort of thing. And he had his flaws, and they were very serious flaws. He was naive about many things, and the associates around him that he gathered, although many of them were fine men and women, the fact of the matter is that he was unable to really judge people's characters. And he got some people who were simply power hungry. One thing that has to be said about Russell that was quite positive, however, Russell never attempted to control the local congregations of Bible students, wherever they were, in the United States, Britain, Germany, Australia. They elected their own elders. And although Russell had established a basis for the way in which they did this, they were free to accept or not to accept most of his ideas. And some of them didn't, of course, eventually. But he was unlike his successor, who was gradually to take full control of the whole movement and become more powerful among the Bible students and Jehovah's Witnesses, as he gave them the name in 1931. He was more powerful than the Pope of Rome within his own organization. And so, in talking about this, I think I'll break off on Russell right now. Thanks for those of you who are listening. I hope this has been a useful discussion.